Well, good afternoon, folks. I think we'll get started here. Dave came a long way to be with us, so we got to give him a chance to get away. He's going to drive back to Spokane tonight. But how many of you read the article in the Ruralite last fall? Yeah. If you're anything like me, it just lit a spark, in my life, and I haven't been able to think of anything but apples since then. And, so it's just a real thrill to have Dave here. He's, as you may know, he grew up in Pullman, attended WSU. He worked for 20 years plus in the IRS and the FBI, so perfectly qualified to do research in old apples, right, as they said. And without further ado, I think you know what he's here for, and I just ask you to welcome Dave Benscoter.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to this day for many years because I've had a lot of people from Puget Sound that have contacted me about old apple trees. Are any of you not from Anderson Island? Hey, that's great. That's great. Are some of those hands people that have already contacted me? Oh, good, good. Well, I'm so glad you're here. One thing that I keep hearing over and over that you don't hear is that there are old apple trees in Puget Sound, and they're hidden away, behind every barn and old homestead on these islands. And I'm just so glad that I can come here and hopefully give you a little bit of information on what you can do if you're really interested in getting your apples identified. And anyway, first of all, this is my project is called the Lost Apple Project, and I had no idea, gosh, I guess it was 10 years ago that I'd be doing anything like this at all. I hadn't been retired too long, and I have a friend, she's a retired missionary that I met her through church, and she lives about 2 miles away from me. And she's disabled, and so I would go over to her house and do little chores for her. And she lives on her family, I won't call it a homestead. I think her dad bought it in the early 1900s, but they did have an old apple orchard on the farm. This is the old apple orchard as it looked in about 1950. And so this fall day, my friend asked me if I could go pick some apples for her, and I said sure. So I grabbed a bucket and I grabbed a ladder, and I went out to the orchard, came back in about 10 minutes, and I said I can't pick a single apple. The orchard hadn't been pruned in, well, just dozens and dozens of years, and there wasn't a single apple I could pick. But I told her I know how to prune apple trees. I'd always had 1 or 2 apple trees in my yard. My dad had taught me how to prune apple trees. I said, within 2 or 3 years, we'll get you, some pretty good apples. Well, that was fall, and that winter, I was probably wondering some snowy day, what kind of apples were those over there? Because I knew there weren't going to be any that I really knew. And so I called her up and I said, do you know what kind of varieties that you had in this orchard? And she said, well, I know the 2 on the very top of the orchard are yellow transparent. And then she called her brother, and her brother said, well, I know that the first row of apples on the very top were wealthy. And besides that, they had no idea of what those apples were. And so I just started digging into information about apples in Eastern Washington, and it was overwhelming, the amount of information there was. Everybody knows about Washington being #1 in apple production in the United States, but of course, that's all along the Columbia River and the tributaries of the Columbia River. In Eastern Washington, there's no such thing as a commercial apple industry anymore. And anyway, so that sort of started my curiosity. Now, just so you know some basics here, this is what Whitman County in Eastern Washington is famous for, wheat seed. And if you plant a wheat seed in the ground, what you're gonna get is a a little shaft of wheat. Well, these are apple seeds, and what you get when you plant an apple seed is totally unlike what you would get if you planted a wheat seed. And apple seeds are kind of like people. They have a mother and they have a father. The mother is the apple tree that has the little blossom on it, and the birds and the bees tell you that the bee will go and collect pollen from another apple tree. Well, that's going to be the father, land on your apple blossom, and every time that happens, every single seed is a brand new variety. So you can't take, like, for example, Honeycrisp seeds and go plant Honeycrisp apples out in, or Honeycrisp seeds in your yard and expect Honeycrisp apples. It just doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, even if you take, really good, like, a Honeycrisp and maybe another really good tasting apple seed, and you take pollen and you do it yourself, chances are it's going to be a lousy tasting apple. And don't ask me why, but that's just the way it turns out. Well, when I started getting interested in the history in Eastern Washington, one of the first books that I purchased was this book, Old Southern Apples by Lee Calhoun. And Lee passed away just before COVID started, February before COVID started. And he's a good friend. He went all over North Carolina, South Carolina, and other states, and trying to find lost apple varieties. And in his search, he also wrote this book. And the book is a wonderful book, and it's basically split in two. The first half of the book are apples that are still available to people, and the last half of the book is old Southern apples believed to be extinct. Well, that was the first time I realized there was such a thing as extinct apples. And Calhoun ultimately found about 400 varieties of once extinct apples. And as I read more and more, I found out about other apple hunters. John Bunker is in Massachusetts. Carlos Manning is in West Virginia. Tom Burford, he was in Virginia. Lee Calhoun, North Carolina, and Tom Brown in North Carolina. I don't know if you see any pattern there, but I certainly did. And there apparently are no lost apples out west because there was nobody looking for them. I didn't even know you could look for lost apples out west. And one day I was researching a nursery owner in Colfax, and he was a person who discovered or introduced the most popular apple that was ever discovered in Eastern Washington. The name of the apple is the Palouse Apple. And for a time in the early 1900s, there was such a demand for Palouse apples back east that they would actually load railroad carloads of apples onto the railroads and send them back to New York and Chicago. And so I was interested in George, and it just happened to be that on the same, in this newspaper, there was an article about Georgerudy. And so I looked at the article, and then I just happened to notice that there was a fair results. It said premiums for these awards paid by the Whitman County Fair Association. So I said, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what prizes they have. The only thing I'd ever entered in a county fair was a sunflower seed when I was in junior high. So, and it actually was at this same fair though. I was living in Pullman, which is about 20 miles from where the fair was. And I started looking on and looked under Fred Huffman. And Fred Huffman, well, he got first in peas. He had largest apple. And then I noticed Mammoth Pippin, Jeffries, Lankford, Jeniton, Walbridge, and Gano. Those are all apple varieties. And some of them I'd heard of, some of them I hadn't heard of. So I started writing down those varieties, and took them back to my Lee Calhoun Old Southern Apple book, and sure enough, the Lankford and the Walbridge were both thought to be extinct. And so at that moment, it was like, I think I'm the only person that knows that there was extinct apples growing in Whitman County in the early 1900s. And it's like, what do I want to do? Well, I'll tell you what, I think I'll dip my toe in the water. I won't really look for apples, but I'll look maybe for one or two. So this Walbridge was the most distinctive apple, and it's also the most popular. It just happened to be from, so I started going through the Colfax Gazettes from 1900 to 1910. And in those years, I found that there were 6 different people that had submitted the Walbridge to the county fair. That was more than any other. There was a couple more lost varieties. This Lankford was a lost variety, and Fred Huffman was the only person who had submitted 2 lost varieties to the county fair. So I knew that the Lankford was lost, the Walbridge was lost, and then there was a couple others that were lost. But the Walbridge was distinctive because, first of all, it was popular. So many people had submitted to the county fair. The other reason was, its other name was the Edgar Red Streak. And I'll show you a picture of it soon, but it was a red apple with dark red or maroon streaks on it. So rather than, just being a red apple, it kind of would stick out. So I called 2 people that I knew were investigating or examining old apples. And it was Joni Cooper and Sean Shepard. At that time, they were with the Home Orchard Society down in Portland. And I said, I'm going to try to find this Walbridge apple. Would you be interested in, taking a look at some apples? And they said, yeah, sure. And they told me how many to pick and which ones to pick. And I think they always want 6 or 7 and how to label them and stuff like that. So I started looking around. I'd been in Colfax looking at orchards. And I'll show you an old picture of Colfax soon. You can see a bunch of pictures on, a bunch of orchards above Colfax. And anyway, so I would just stop and I'd ask people if I could pick apples from their apple trees, and they said sure. And so I'd found 3 that I thought were really good possibilities: red apples, red streaks. And just as I was about to leave Colfax, I went by this water pump station, and leaning over this water pump station were branches of the weirdest apple I'd ever seen. And I described it apples with corners on them. And I thought, that is really one bizarre looking apple. So I picked 5 or 6 of them, and then I contacted Joni and Sean, and I said, I've got these probably 3 or 4 bags of maybe possible Walbridge, and then can I throw in this other bag? And they said, oh, sure. So I did. Okay, now we're going to go back in history. I'm going to tell you the end of that story in a minute. Okay, so when Pilgrims arrived in the United States, they weren't carrying grafted trees with them. What they were carrying were bushels of apple seeds. And if you remember, back in the from your high school or junior high days, when they told you about world history, back in the 1500s, 1600s, it seemed like countries were going through the Black Plague about every 20 or 30 years. They didn't understand that that was caused by bacteria. They didn't even know what bacteria was. But what they did know was you don't drink the water. And if you were in London, and you would know that all the sewage went in the river. If somebody died from the plague, they threw them in the river. They threw their bedding in the river. Everything went into the river. And all they knew was you don't drink the water, but drink hard cider. And in Europe, the amount of hard cider that was that each person drank was just an incredible amount. And even small children, even toddlers would receive hard cider, watered down hard cider, but still it was hard cider. And as soon as Pilgrims arrived in America, they didn't realize, well, you've got the purest water around, and they just knew we have to drink hard cider because that's what we do. There's an example of what the cider press did. Now, after the Revolutionary War, of course, Lewis and Clark went out here to the West Coast in 1804. It was right about that time, just before that, we got the Louisiana Purchase and the Spanish territory, and we finally got also the borders of Washington, Idaho, and Montana figured out. And so finally, Lewis and Clark came west. It was about 1937, I believe, 1840. 1840 is when the Oregon Trail was first used. And the Oregon Trail kind of went through near Walla Walla, Washington, and the Whitman mission in near Walla Walla. Okay, this is Marcus, picture of Marcus. He arrived at what was then the Whitman mission in 1836. Along with him, he had another missionary, and of course his family. The other missionary was a fellow by the name of Spalding. He ended up pretty close to Lewiston in Lapwai, Idaho, and Marcus stayed though at the mission there near Walla Walla. And this is what they came out in. They came out in these buggies or wagons, and everybody had the exact same wagon. Now in 1847, and if you remember, the Oregon Trail opened up in 1840. Marcus Whitman arrived in 1936, so he came even before the Oregon Trail was. And Henderson Wells is just a giant in Northwest history, because when he came out west in 1847, he brought a nursery in his wagons, and he had all sorts of tree fruit like apples and pears and peaches and plums, and then he also had small fruit, and he packed all those in a wagon with some soil, charcoal, and every night he would water his plants. And in 1847, it was probably, I want to say maybe August of 1847, he actually went through and met Marcus Whitman. Marcus Whitman asked him if he would consider staying there, and Llewellyn said, no, I'm headed for Oregon. And so he continued on his way. And it was only a couple of months later that Marcus Whitman actually was killed by the Native Americans. They were having smallpox going through the Indian camps, and it was terrible. So the result of that was that all homesteading was basically turned off. The Army said no more homesteads in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, until we get this situation under control. Fort Walla Walla was built in 1856, and in 1858, the Army said, okay, we feel that the uprisal is over, and you can now homestead eastern Washington and in these places in northern Idaho and eastern Oregon. And Ransom Clark, they opened it up in 1858. Ransom Clark began his nursery in 1859. He was ready as soon as the Army said go, and he came into Walla Walla. He hired a man to help him build a cabin. He got his son to go with him, and they started building the cabin, and he got his nursery stock in. And then Ransom decided he needed to go back to Portland to bring his wife, another small child, and then his wife was also pregnant with another child. Well, on the way home, Ransom probably got pneumonia because he never did return to Walla Walla. And he died there in Portland. And of course, Latisse, her parents and relatives all said, well, obviously you're not going back to Walla Walla. You're not a man. And Latisse said, well, I'm going to go check it out. You know, Ransom really thought this was a wonderful place to live. So she went out, she boarded a steamship up the Columbia River, got as close to Walla Walla as you can, then got out, took a stagecoach the rest of the way to Walla Walla, informed her son, first time he had heard that his dad had died, and then the cabin was built though, it was finished, and she took a look around and said, yeah, I think we can make a go of it. And so she went back to Portland, had her baby, and then turned around and came back out and joined her children there in that first nursery in Walla Walla. And to this day, Latisse is really a revered person in Walla Walla. They named a wine after her. They have a play that is run every few years in Walla Walla during like summer play season, summer stock. This is a picture of the Ransom Clark. Oh, here, this is me. I've just been transported back in time to the Ransom Clark cabin. No, actually, this is on the premises of the Fort Walla Walla Museum. And they moved that cabin there, and it's wonderful. They have that piece of history there. Just to give you an idea, you see where Walla Walla is on the very bottom of the screen. And most of the nurseries I'm going to tell you about today are from Walla Walla or from Colfax. Colfax is the county seat for Whitman County, and Walla Walla is in another county. Okay. Here's this is a pamphlet that was prepared in 1884. The reason I'm showing it to you is to show you how important apples were to homesteaders. The name of this pamphlet was something having to do with a homesteading guide for homesteaders going into Nebraska. Now, obviously, we're not in Nebraska, but I think the same things that they recommended apply to out here out west. But two different experts in this book said that here I'll go down to the very last line, and it says in all. Where in all. Where is it? Oh, in all 100. Yeah, in all 100, right there in the last line. These experts were recommending just a family, not a big family, but a family plant 100 apple trees. And you think, wow, that seems like a lot of trees. Well, it is a lot of trees, but that's how important apples were. And this fellow and the other person I mentioned, they both gave the number of trees of each kind. And if you'll notice, they start off with Summer, Red June, Duchess of Oldenburg, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, you get down to Ben Davis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's fifth sentence down. Ben Davis, 18 apples, and Wine Sap, 25 apples. The reason there were so many of those is because Ben Davis was a tremendously important apple. If you had a really ripe Ben Davis in your hand right now and took a bite at it, you'd say, that's an okay apple. You probably wouldn't say, wow, that's a wonderful apple. But the one key thing that Ben Davis apples had over all the other apples was it kept longer in your cellar than any of the other apples. So you could have fresh apples in April, May, possibly even into early June if you had the right conditions. And I mean, there's no other vegetable, or excuse me, no other fruit that you can do that with. Okay, we'll move on here. Okay. This family here is very close. I'm going to talk to you about a family in a minute. But this family is in Palouse country in Whitman County, Right along that, you see that cliff above them, the Palouse River runs right above them. This is the conditions they were living in. Now this guy must have been pretty wealthy because he actually had wooden houses and a wooden barn. Obviously he didn't have a lot of trees around. There are a lot of pine trees along there. Of course he might have chopped them all down. But there's a family, and over on the left are the uses of apples. You could eat them fresh from July to May. You can bake them, you can fry them, you can stew them, you can can them, you can dry them, you can sauce them, you can make hard cider, although I don't have much evidence that the homesteaders did much, drank much hard cider. I'll come back to that in a minute. Apple cider vinegar is important if you're going to preserve other foods. Apple butter or apple molasses. If you don't know what that is when you take usually really sweet apples and you put them in a big pot and then you just start stewing them. You just start stewing them and letting the moisture be released from those apples, and what you get at the very end is just kind of like molasses. And that doesn't seem like that big a deal, but when you're out here 70 miles away from the nearest place where you could get supplies, and you don't want to pay money to get sugar, apple butter is the way to go because it's very sugary and sweet, and then finally diseased fruit can even be fed to animals. Now, going back to hard cider for a moment, I've got lots of nursery catalogs, nursery flyers from the late 1800s, early 1900s, but I've found no listing of hard cider apples at all in any of these lists. I think the temperance movement was pretty strong, and by 1910, Pullman was dry, and I think before 2 or 3 more years, most of the county, or excuse me, most of eastern Washington was dry. So if they did make hard cider, I think it was just done kind of secretly. Okay, Philip Ritz, he was the second nurseryman in Walla Walla, and he really was an important figure in the history of eastern Washington. Everybody knows Ritzville. Well, it's named after Philip Ritz. After he started his nursery in Walla Walla, he expanded it to, well, it was huge. Within just a few years, he had over 1 million trees in his nursery. And this is a nursery catalog that was at Washington State University. You can't probably see it, but it's dated 1879. And boy, I tell you what, I've been so fortunate to find old nursery catalogs, nursery flyers, and so here's apples. I don't know if you can read them, but there says Carolina Red June, Early Pennock. Those are just some of the apples that were. Okay, now one here on this page, not the page with the pears on it, but if you'll notice at the very bottom of this page are Titovsky, 4th of July, Surprise, and Seedless. Okay, when I found this catalog, I had no idea that Surprise Apple had been sold by the Philip Ritz Nursery. And because I only got my hands on this catalog about a year and a half ago, and our apple identification experts had identified the Surprise being in an orchard just outside of Dayton, Washington, probably 5 years ago. And it's, I always like to have proof that an apple was actually growing in that part of the country. And there's been, I'll tell you another story. Okay, so Joni and Sean, the apple identification experts, are so good. And there's only about 5 apple identification experts in the United States right now. And Joni and Sean are right up there. I would probably think they're the best. So in about, I want to say 2018, a friend of mine in our committee, he lives in Troy, Idaho. He got a call from a guy, and the guy said, "Hey, I've got an apple tree out here, and it's ripe right now. Do you want to come take a look at it?" So EJ, he's part of our committee, said, "Sure." Went over, and of course, there's no apples that are ripe in July except for yellow transparent. He goes over and he picks some of the apples. He then sends them to Joni and Sean. Usually it takes weeks, maybe even months to get results back, but there's no apples coming in this time of year. So we get a result back right away, and they say, "That's a Seri Synap." And I said, "What's a Seri Synap?" And so I started reviewing the information we had. Turns out the Seri Synap is a Turkish apple. My thought is, okay, what's a Turkish apple doing in Troy, Idaho? And it was 2 weeks later, I got an email from WSU. And WSU, different people knew that I was looking into old apples, and got especially a fellow at the archives. And I got an email from somebody who was working at the archives, and they said, "We just discovered a whole bunch of records from WSU about 1904. And it looks like WSU had about maybe 400 varieties of apples in 1904. Would you be interested in looking at those?" I was like, "Yeah, I would be." And so I went there the next week and started going through those records, and when you know it, Seri Synap was in those records. That just blew me away. I mean, Joni and Sean could be that good. Okay, here's an ad for Philip Ritz Nursery. This ad was actually in the Colfax Gazette, but there he is advertising. Now Colfax had its own nurseries that I'm going to talk to you about. Philip Ritz, though, for him to advertise in Colfax, what he would do is, like many nurseries at the time, they had what they called tree agents or nursery agents. And these fellows would ride on their horse, and in maybe very early spring, maybe even the fall, prior fall, and they'd carry a big old catalog. And this big old catalog had beautiful watercolor paintings of fruit. And they'd lay this out on the homesteader's dining room table, and then the wife and the husband would come over and they'd look at these, and hopefully if the nursery agent was good, he could tell them, well, this one is really good for dried fruit, if you want to dry it, and this one is really good for saucing, and of course the Ben Davis is one you want because it keeps the longest. And that was all well and good, but that also came kind of, the nursery agents often had a shady reputation. There were instances, for example, in Kansas, where guys would come through and they'd have, the good, nice catalogs and everything, and the people would pay them, and that's the last time you would see them. Or they'd come and they'd bring you fruit the next year. They'd bring you apple trees and some other twigs and things like that, and of course, you weren't going to get fruit off of them for about 3 or 4 years, maybe longer, and so you might even order some more. Well, that could have been just about anything. So they often had a bad reputation. Okay, just to give you an idea of the population. Okay, in 1870, Walla Walla clearly was the leader in population. It wasn't really until 1884 when the trains hit Eastern Washington. Once the trains were in Eastern Washington, take a look at what happened to Spokane. And there was people filing in, there was mining up in the mountains, there was timber up in the mountains, and anyway, so things really started going fast after the trains here. Okay, now in 1872, Theophilus Smith opened the Palouse Nursery in Colfax. And Theophilus was actually one of the very first settlers, homesteaders in Colfax. And if you look if you look here, there's downtown Colfax, and Theophilus, that's the Theophilus Smith that's where he lived and where his nursery was. This is from a flyer from his nursery. And this actually came from Washington State University. They saved it somehow. And I put little boxes around 2 of the lost varieties that that I know he carried. The Walbridge, where I mentioned to you already. The other apple looks like it's Islam sweet, but that's misspelling. Oftentimes you'll get misspellings. As a matter of fact, in the Colfax Gazette, when I was going through the fair results, there's an apple called the Rawls Genet, and it will be called the Genet. It will be called, and there's another apple I'll tell you about called the Fulgeniting, and it was spelled every which way you can imagine, but that should be Isham sweet. Okay, Georgerudy was the next nurseryman to come to Colfax. He was the fellow I mentioned before. Unfortunately, this is all the apple varieties I'm aware that he carried. I don't have a flyer and I don't have a catalog from him. There's George right next to a chestnut tree. I haven't seen George lately, so if you recognize him, let me know. There's George, has a really nice, he put in a really nice ad, and as soon as he did that, Theophilus Smith put in a really nice ad, and they kind of had this going back and forth, who would have the best ads. Now this is called the Hanford Tower. This was owned by the Edwin Hanford family in Oakdale. Oakdale's about 12, 13 miles north of Colfax, and Edwin was a wealthy man. He came from the Midwest, and he came out west and came to Oakdale, and he was absolutely convinced Oakdale was going to be the next Spokane, and he was wrong. But he did build this wonderful castle, had 8,000 square feet. You could play basketball in the attic. Separate staircase for the servants. It's a wonderful, and the people that own it now have done a wonderful job of restoring it. And Hanford himself had a nursery and an orchard, commercial orchard. Here is a nursery flyer from 1902. Thank goodness his relatives hung on to this. And all the little boxes here, these are all lost apples. In the first column it says winter varieties, Dickinson. We actually have found that apple, and we found it about 8 miles from Hanford's nursery. The scarlet cranberry, we're still looking for that. Iser Spitzenberg, we're looking for that. Piles Red Winter and Babbitt. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little secret. I think we found the Babbitt. I don't know if we're going to, I don't know if we're going to announce it this year, or if, sorry, I got to go back. I'm not sure if we're going to announce it this year and let it, and wait, or wait till next year after we do some DNA testing on it. But I do believe we found that apple. The Nero, we found the Nero apple about 300 yards from the Dickinson apple, of course near Oakdale. Then Cornell Fancy and Charlatan. And then I want to show you, you see that other red box right in the middle, and it says the above list of trees is just the choice of 145 different kinds fruited in our 200 acres. Okay, so in other words, this, and I think there's about 60 apples here listed. Now he says there's actually 145 different varieties at our orchard. Okay, and then one other thing, take a look just above that block and to the John apple. Well, the relative of Mr. Hanford who gave me this said John was named after her great-grandfather. And John was the youngest son of Edwin Hanford. And that's interesting because, well, I'll show you here in just a second. So, and John is described as resembles Duchess of Oldenburg, but is months later keeping all winter. And the Duchess of Oldenburg is an early apple. So in other words, if you see a Duchess of Oldenburg and it's ripe in October, that's probably a John apple. Okay. Now here's a stereoscope of Edwin Hanford out in his seedling orchard. And what he did as a nurseryman, and not a lot of nurserymen did this at that time, was he created his own rootstock. And he would order seeds from back east, and then he had a little machine that's called a Planet Junior, and I forget what something drill, planting drill. And there's a hopper, and you'd put all your apple seeds in there, and then there were little adjustments that you could make, and you could adjust how far apart this dropper would drop seeds and how many seeds it would drop. So you could drop 1 seed every 1 foot. You could drop 4 seeds every 16 inches, whatever you wanted. This drill is how you do it, and I thought it was pretty cool. It looked like it looked to me like Hanford was probably putting more than one seedling down, one or more seeds down every time. Okay, that's what the Hanford house looks like today. And behind the Hanford house is a green belt. And you can't see it that well, but on many Palouse hills, if you go over, into the Palouse by Pullman, Spokane, you'll see these rolling hills. But often they'll roll up and then all of a sudden they just drop off on the back. Well, you can't farm that land. It's way too steep. So what they would do is they'd put in a green belt, put pine trees. And in this case, since it was Hanford, he also put in a lot of fruit trees. So there are still apple trees, pear trees, plum trees growing back there. One we're still looking at as a possible lost variety. There's that wall bridge I spoke to you about earlier, and you can see some streaking. Oh, and these watercolor photos are so amazing. Okay, so in about 1880, the U.S. Government decided to contract with watercolor artists. And what they were to do was paint watercolors of different fruits and nuts. And I mean, the foresight is just amazing, because you remember, we don't have color photography back then. And the wall bridge actually was painted a number of times, probably at least 5 times. So we have some really nice watercolors of it. And luckily, almost all the lost varieties that we've come across have had a watercolor painting done of them. Okay, I mentioned to you the apple with the corners on them. That's the fall geniting. And the fall geniting, it's a beautiful apple. And so when Joni and Sean identified that apple for me, the first thing I did was I started checking with other apple nurseries or heritage nurseries around the country. And then, of course, some of the other apple hunters like Lee Calhoun with John Bunker. And I just gone through almost everybody except John Bunker. And I thought, I better call John Bunker, because I was really excited. I thought, I think I found the first lost variety in Washington. And I called John Bunker, and he said, oh, I found a fall geniting just last year. So it was close, and that gave me a lot of optimism, because even though it wasn't a lost variety, it was pretty close. So the next year, there's a beautiful watercolor of the fall geniting, and I found it. This is in Colfax. And I mentioned to you that Theophilus Smith had a nursery. Well, Theophilus Smith also was one of the main people who started Colfax College. And that building there is Colfax College. Well, I found that fall genting right about in the backyard of that building. And I thought that was significant because not only was there an apple nursery owner who had a reason to put an apple tree behind there, but also F.N. English, who was a teacher and president of the college, he actually submitted apples to the county fair. So I think probably one of those two guys probably planted that fall genting. Okay, now this is a graft of the fall genting on one of my trees. And let's see, and what I do when I put a graft of another apple on my trees is, first of all, I'll show you the graft. Okay, this right here is the graft. Okay, it kind of is like a Z there. And we do that kind of grafting in the spring. And then once I know it's a viable graft, I'll put an aluminum tag on it and write the name of it on there. And it is great. What we're attempting to do is make sure that we get all of the lost varieties that we've found growing in our backyards, because some of the locations that we've had to go back to are rather remote. I don't know if I have the picture here, but one of the time we had a terrible series of snowstorms in February, and we had to go out on snowmobiles, and it was not fun. Okay, there is Stepto Butte. Stepto Butte is absolutely amazing for the old apple orchards that are still there. Okay, this is taken obviously in the dormant season. I think this was maybe January, something like that. But you can see the pine trees are green, but you also see a lot of gray trees, and those are deciduous trees, and the majority of those are fruit trees. There are mostly apple trees, and pear trees, plum trees, cherry trees. There's just a wild amount, and you never find like a row of one kind of apple like you might expect if it was a commercial orchard. Anyway, so that's Stepto Butte. This is the north side of Stepto Butte, and let's see. Okay, so you see between Spokane and Colfax, and then you see Rosalia between Spokane and Colfax. And if you go right to about here, that's where Stepto Butte is. And I forget, it's Stepto Butte, as well as you can see, just rises right out of the wheat, the wheat land below it. Okay, this is an 1895 Whitman County plat map. And I don't know if you can see, but okay, what this says Stepto Butte. So that's supposedly the butte right there. So that's Stepto Butte. Basically the north quarter of Stepto Butte is owned by R.E. Burns. That's Robert Burns. And the rest of the butte, James S. Davis, he owns the other 3/4 of the butte. Okay, now this is what it looks like today. Okay, so you notice what the Burns homestead looks like. Okay, if you follow my little pointer right here, that's the road coming into the Stepto Butte State Park. You come in here, and right in here is a picnic area. And then you go over here, and then you start rising. You come around the butte, and you go around the butte and around the butte, and finally you end up on the very summit. You see where Robert Burns' homestead was. Here at the picnic area, a lot of apple trees, a lot of fruit trees. All along in here, there's right here, there's a pond. And so there's plenty of water coming down this way. So a lot of these trees are in really good shape for being that old. Then as you climb here, this is kind of a ravine that goes up here, a lot of apple trees, and then a lot of apple trees up in this area right there. Then finally over here, there's a west orchard. This is an orchard we believe that the Davis family planted. And finally a southwest orchard, probably 250 apple trees between these two orchards. And then to tell you the truth, all around the butte. Anytime there's a little ravine, you'll find a few apple trees in every ravine. But these are the main orchards. And I think there's probably at least 400 apple trees in the Robert Burns homestead. Let's see. Oh, and I mentioned the Nero. Nero is just right as you come into the park, right down here, what I call kind of the toe of the boot. And then the Dickinson is right here. And the Arkansas Beauty was found over here in the West Orchard. Okay. Now this is Robert Burns and his family. And poor Robert Burns, I don't think he weighed 140 pounds. And he fell in love with Macy. And Macy's dad lived, let me go back here. Okay, so you see where Stepto Butte is. And if you go right over here, pretty close by it, right on the bottom there, where it says about 28, it says G.W. Hume. Well, Macy's maiden name is Hume. And Robert married this gentleman's daughter. And I just have a hunch that he probably said, well, you can marry my daughter, but you're not going very far away. And Stepto Butte, let's go back another one. Okay. Okay, so I think Stepto Butte, at the time that Robert Burns started farming it, where you see those pine trees, I think that was all pine trees coming down off of the butte. And that's why in 1888, that was not really a great time to be picking out homestead land. All the good land had already been homesteaded on, and the only reason this land had not was because it had a lot of pine trees. A lot of this land, well, if it's got pine trees and you don't farm it, the reason is agriculture equipment couldn't go on it. So it was too steep, all sorts of reasons. You can see, here's Robert Burns' homestead 100 years later, and it's not even half the ground is being, you can grow on. So anyway, Robert started out kind of in a hole anyway. So Robert marries Macy in 1888. I think it was January 1st of 1888. And they immediately homesteaded the land. And after your land homesteaded 5 years, the land is yours. Well, by 1893, they already had 2 or 3 kids. And unfortunately, in 1893, there was a terrible catastrophe that happened in this part of the country. And it was pretty localized in just the Oakdale, Garfield part of Washington. And what happened was the rains came in early, probably September, and then they didn't hold up, or they didn't disperse. It would just continually rain, and the crops never were brought in. Well, for somebody who is solely a wheat farmer, that's a catastrophe, because that's all his income for the year. So likely what happened was Robert probably borrowed some money, and he decided, and one step back also, the way I found this out was by going to a website called findagrave.com. And Find a Grave is, if you haven't been on it, it's wonderful. And it just so happened that one of Robert's relatives had a written history of the family, knew all about what happened with Robert. And it was very interesting the way they wrote his history too. Because what they, wrote about it was, first of all, the weather catastrophe in 1893. And then Robert decided to diversify. And what he decided to do, which was really smart actually, was to diversify by growing fruit. And not far from Stepto Butte, a little to the east, was a town called Elberton. And Elberton was locally famous at that time because it had what they declared was the world's largest prune dryer. So Robert put in prunes, he put in pears, apples, cherries, and that was a pretty smart idea. But the problem was, of course, back then, everything was on standard rootstock. Today, if you go to Wenatchee or Yakima or places like that, all the apple trees are only this tall. And those apple trees start producing fruit probably their third year. Well, producing on standard rootstock, you might not get an apple for 6, 7 years. A northern spy takes you 10 years to get an apple off of it. So that was to blame. And the other thing that Robert did that he shouldn't have done was he didn't only plant a few varieties. It looked to me like he just drove his wagon up to the Hanford nursery and put one of everything in the back. And going through all the trees, very rare to find two of the same kind of trees next to each other. So Robert, he made a couple of questionable decisions, and the bottom line was he lost the farm in 1899. And this is a document where he lost the farm. He actually got someone to buy it. It was purchased for $1, and the fellow who bought it had to take over the note on the property for $1,000. And Robert moved to Elberton and became a little shop owner. Okay, that's once again, that shows you not only Robert Burns' property, but also the James S. Davis property. Okay, Davis is kind of a notorious person in eastern Washington. I grew up in Pullman, so I know Whitman County history, and he was always considered kind of, I don't know if an outlaw is right, but he always was eccentric. And in 1875, he arrived in Whitman County, and a few years later, he built a stagecoach station, and this is just west. Stepto Butte would be right up here, behind it, to the east. He had a dance hall, so of course a bar, a hotel, stagecoach. Your horses could be fed in the barn, and you could rest there. All this was going on, of course, in 1875. That's the thing to do. Well, in 1884, that's when the trains arrived, and suddenly there wasn't a need for stagecoach stations anymore. And people were going long distances. If you're going to go from Colfax to Spokane, you weren't taking a wagon anymore. You would jump on a train, and that was much faster. And so what Davis decided to do, he still had a pocket full of money. He went and built a hotel on the top of Stepto Butte. How many of you have actually been in Eastern Washington, seen Stepto Butte? So you know how it really does. It just rises out of the farmland. And Stepto Butte is basically a giant rock. And so to build a road up and around to the summit of Stepto Butte was an accomplishment, a dangerous accomplishment. The road that is used today is not that road. They've put in a slightly better road. But you can imagine trying to take a wagon or a stagecoach to the top of that road. And it's an amazing small world that we live in, because when I had a need to interview a relative of Mr. Davis. And actually it was a fellow, he came up to me it was a land sale. The land around Stepto Butte was being sold. And this fellow comes up to me and he said, "Did you know that I'm related to Cashup Davis?" I said, "Oh, really cool." And I said, I might like to talk to you later." And so I did, and I got together with him. And here is the official story on the hotel on Stepto Butte. So Cashup builds this. In 1888, it opens. It's only popular for maybe 2 years, maybe a year and a half. People are scared to death to go up to the top of it. At first, it was really cool. If you're up on the top of it, you can see clear down almost to Walla Walla. And I mean, it's amazing. But people just didn't want to go up there. It was too far away from everything. And so Cashup went bankrupt. His wife passed away, then he lived out his final days. And then he passed away in about 1911. The hotel burned down. Nobody knew what happened, but it was always theorized that maybe kids were up there playing with matches or smoking or something. Well, I spoke to a fellow, and he's a relative he's a relative of someone who lived close to the Butte. And he said, this is what my dad told me. He said that my dad was in Spokane. I want to say this was probably about 30, 40 years ago, something like that. And he said that a man called him up, and basically he was on his deathbed. And he was in a Spokane hospital. And his dad didn't know this fellow, but the fellow knew him. And he said, I want you to come. I got something I got to tell you. And so his dad went to the hospital, and the fellow told him, he said, I can't live with this. I got to tell you. And he said that I was one of the kids that burned down the hotel on Stepto Butte. And he said what happened was all the husbands of the wives in Oakdale and Garfield and Elberton, every Friday or Saturday night, they'd grab some alcohol, maybe some women of ill repute, and they'd head for the top of Stepto Butte, where this abandoned hotel was, and have a party. And the women had it. And so they paid a couple of teenage boys to go burn that hotel down.